title of this panel is a conversation about where do we go from here. And we are blessed to have with us some of the stalwart figures who made this moment right here possible. So in some ways, it's a kind of pietistic gesture on my part to say that we're indebted to have you here because you and your work made us possible. So with that, we first just celebrate them. I want to encourage all of you to visit our website to view the video from last week. Last week's discussion, Hands on the Freedom Cloud. This was an extraordinary account of women's involvement in the SNCC movement. And we have Judith Richardson here, and Dorothy Zellner, and Janet Moses, and Martha Norman Noonan, and Betty. See, they weren't even here, they were in the names. But it was an extraordinary discussion, some powerful stories, and they have really set the tone. And in fact, they told us that today they were required to bring it in their discussion. This conversation came about in some ways as a result of the appointment of Robert Bob Moses here at Princeton as our distinguished visiting professor. And we had an opportunity to have the SNCC Legacy Board come and meet in the Center for African American Studies. And we thought that we wanted to continue that conversation, not just simply in the privacy of Stanhope, but with the community at large. So what I want to do is briefly introduce each participant. You can see in your programs a much more developed and elaborate biography. So I'll say a few words. First, we have Charlie Cobb, former SNCC Field Secretary. He's a journalist, author, and senior analyst for allafrica.com. He's also a visiting professor at Brown University. And from 1985 to 1997, Mr. Cobb was a staff writer for National Geographic magazine. His latest book is entitled On the Road to Freedom, a guided tour of the Civil Rights Trail. Next to him, while at Howard University, Cox became a member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. In 1963, he served as the SNCC representative on the steering committee for the March on Washington. Mr. Cox is presently a consultant with the Office of Public Education Facilities Management and is responsible for the participation of district businesses, that's Washington, D.C., and residents in the construction, rehabilitation, and maintenance of schools in the District of Columbia. Next to Mr. Cox is Idaho Donaldson, who was a very active member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee from 1960 to 1962. Mr. Donaldson was a SNCC field secretary, and in '63 he was engaged in demonstrations in Danville, Virginia. Mr. Donaldson was also active during Freedom Summit, Mississippi in 1964. After the Southern Christian Leadership Conference began planning for a march on Selma, from Selma to Montgomery in '65, Mr. Donaldson became one of SNCC's organizers in Selma. He's currently the chairman of the Philman Group in Washington, D.C., a political research firm. To my immediate left is Robert Bob Harris Moses, a prominent figure in the civil rights movement as the field secretary for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, participated in initiating SNCC's Mississippi Voter Registration Project. That summer was appointed as director in '62. He helped to lead the Council of Federated Organizations into the Mississippi Freedom Project, which parachuted the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party to the National Democratic Convention in Atlantic City. Mr. Moses is currently the distinguished visitor for the Center, African American Center at Princeton. Next to Mr. Moses is Professor Imani Perry, professor in the Center for African American Studies and faculty associate in the program in law and program in public affairs. Professor Perry is an interdisciplinary scholar who studies race and African American culture using the tools provided by various disciplines, including law, literary and cultural studies, music, and the social sciences. Her latest book is entitled More Beautiful and More Terrible, The Embrace and Transcendence of Racial Inequality in the United States. And lastly is Larry Rubin, who was a SNCC field secretary off and on between 1961 and 65. first in Southwest Georgia and then in northern Mississippi. For 45 years, Mr. Rubin has worked in the labor movement as an organizer, media and public relations specialist, speechwriter, publications editor, and political advocate. He is currently the communications director and DC area political director for the Mid-Atlantic Regional Council of Carpenters, an affiliate of the Carpenters Union. So the format,
I'm still stuck in that 45 years.
45 years, yeah. So the format is a conversation. It's been a long day, and we're about to have an extraordinary conversation. So the idea is for us to have an exchange. We'll ask a few questions, give our panelists a chance to respond, and then we'll have a back and forth. And then from there, we'll open it up to Q&A, and then we'll have a conversation with the audience. And so what I would like to first ask, I haven't asked the first question. How did you, or do you imagine your work with SNCC, looking back on it after all of these years? What do you now take yourself to have been engaged in? What did you take yourself to be doing in that moment? Give us a sense of your decision-making to join and how it was transformative when you looking back on all of these years.
Well, I don't know much. I don't know whether or not we so much joined SNCC has gotten caught up in the movement that was unfolding across the South, even before SNCC. I'll skip, the students, to speak directly to our experience, erupted in sit-ins in the South. And most of us were going to historically black colleges and universities, which means that we were going to school in the South, and we get caught up in this. It probably would take far more time than we have now here to analyze how and why this historical moment captured us in such a way as to pull us into the movement. But clearly, we got caught up in a movement that had been really unfolding when we were kids, certainly. Secondly, when I look back on it, I don't think, with one exception, very differently now than I thought then, because I saw the movement then as a movement of community organizing more than I saw it as a movement of mass protest in public spaces led by charismatic leaders. I thought that then, which is part of what attracted me to the Mississippi movement, and I still think that when I look back on the movement. The big difference for me, and I'm going to end with this because it leads to a larger conversation, the big difference between me in 1961, 62, when I kind of show up or get washed up on the shores of Mississippi, and now in the second decade of the 20th century, is I pay a lot more attention to the differences and tensions between the haves and have-nots. That's partially a racial issue, but I thought much more in racial terms in the 1960s. And without abandoning what I was raised to be, which was a race man, and without trying to claim that we live in a post-racial era, I spend much more of my time and thinking around the issues of who has and who doesn't have.
I think looking back from where I am today and trying to see where I was 50 years ago, I think about the journey that we've traveled. And I think about when I started, when I was the age of some of you in here or younger, and what we faced at that point. We faced physical intimidation by state law, by prisons, and by the police. We faced terrorism by the organized groups such as the Klan and others. We faced psychological intimidation by the newspapers, by the academia, by by the press. We faced barriers in terms of housing, public accommodation, education, and all of these things were part of a systematic effort to exclude and, as the term and the phrase, keep the Negro in his place. I think that over the last 50 years, I think some of those barriers have been destroyed or eroded, particularly in the area of state-sponsored physical violence, particularly in the area of psychological intimidation, where we as a community used to say things like, niggas ain't shit, because that was what the society told us. I think we have come a long way in terms of dealing with some of the barriers, but there are things that are still there that we have to overcome, and there are new issues, such as the information economy that we now have to pay attention to. The other thing that is also very important as I look back is that I understand Roy Wilkins, who as a young person I thought was a waste of time. But he was the person that helped, and the NAACP. I understand Du Bois. I understand that each generation, as we go forth, as Fanon talks about, has a mission. And that I begin to see more clearly as I begin to look back, you know, some perspective of what we have done, what was built for us in terms of how we got to where we were, and also what's left to be done.
Yeah, I like each generation has a mission. I think that I grew up with a mission. And very fortunately, in some ways, I look back and realized that there was a mission. I was 18 when the student sit-in started in Greensboro, in Raleigh, and in Greensboro in 1960. And I was a writer and a track star at Michigan State back then. And I wrote for the State News. And Negro History Month had just, a week at that point in time, it was called Negro History Week, had just ended. And I had did a series of pieces on Marcus Garvey for a lot of reasons, personal reasons, historical reasons. My parents were West Indian. You know, I was born in Harlem, I grew up in New York, I went to New York public high schools. And I started to think then that, you know, what's going to change what was going on? I was at Michigan State, East Lansing, Michigan. East Lansing was a town where blacks could not buy a house. But the president of Michigan State University, Dr. John Hanna, was chair of the United States Civil Rights Commission. And I used to picket him because I didn't understand that. I didn't know what picketing was. I just had a sign. I used to walk around his house, used to annoy him. And the more he got annoyed, the more I would go walking around his house. And sometimes people would join me, sometimes it was like a personal mission. And I was sitting in the student young one afternoon when the paper came in, and they showed these students sitting in Greensboro. And it was like something struck me. I couldn't believe it. Someone struck a blow for freedom, and I knew I had to be a part of it. Didn't know why, I just had to be. I began to think years later that our generation had a historical imperative. We were children all over the world that were fighting for independence and freedom. Many of us had our parents killed in World War I, our fathers were bombed, our mothers were killed in the airplane factory. We were a generation that had something in common no matter where we were. And that freedom movement reflected itself in Africa, reflected itself in Europe, reflected itself in Asia, and it was now reflecting itself in the United States. A continuum, by the way, from the days of slavery coming forward, because as we like to say, we all grew up on the shoulders of somebody. And I saw this as a mandatory thing to do. I went to North Carolina the following week. I hitchhiked down there to meet these people. They were heroes. I mean, I just couldn't figure out. I didn't know where I was going. And that was the end of that. I got there, they said, you need to go back to your community and picket Woolworths and the 5 and 10 stores in support of us. So that's what I went back and did. And I started doing that Well, in Lansing, Michigan, there was a mosque run by Phillips Gas. And I used to babysit for a guy named Bob Little, who was getting his PhD at Michigan State. And I didn't know that they were related. But a friend of mine took me to the mosque because Malcolm X was speaking down there one day, and I got to meet Malcolm. We started talking. He asked me what I did, and I said this, that, and the next thing. And in the middle of the conversation, somehow or another, I said, I had babysit for this brother who was getting his PhD. His name is Bob Little. And there was this silence. And then finally, he said, so you were babysitting for my little baby brother? And I said, your baby brother, Bob Little. I mean, I couldn't put the two together. And I mean, we live in such a small world where the dynamics crosses us all the time. I mean, when I look back, I think of the amazing people that I've met, heroes, everyone, and you don't know it at the time. I mean, Byard Rustin, he was a mentor, and he was so much smaller, such a small part of my life, but such a major impact on my life. And as I look forward, I realize that each generation has to lift its flag and go forward. We used to ignore senior citizens tell us what to do because they always say, you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't win, we tried that. But we did it anyway. And sometimes we won, and sometimes we didn't. But we were going forward. And that's what I think we have to talk about today. How do we keep going forward? How do we keep struggling against this massive oppression? And the tools are so different. I mean, we were organizing when people had community lines on the phone. And we had radios, CD radios and stuff, There was no Gestetner machines. I mean, there was no email, if we had the technology that today, back in 1961, we would have organized the earth, not just Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, so because today, communications is unlimited. I mean, look what the students did in Egypt, with technology. So we have to figure out how to keep going forward, and that's where I'll stop at the moment.
So I was a little older when the sit-ins hit. I was 25 and teaching, but I was caught up. I like Charlie's idea, and what I've said. I was looking at the pictures of the students who were sitting in, and it was something in those pictures. They looked like, to me, like I felt inside. And so I arranged to go down and see Uncle Bill, my father's brother, who was teaching at Hampton Institute in my spring break. And so the students at Hampton were sitting in Newport News, and Wyatt T. Walker came down to do the mass meeting and announced that SCLC was going to set up a meeting in Harlem, and that's where I grew up, that's where I was living. And so I went back and actually made Byard, I met Byard. I went to the organizing meeting for the office in Harlem, and Byard ran that office. And so I began volunteering, coming down after school every day. And they actually did the event to raise money at the 369th Armory, where my father had been working all his life, and Harry Belafonte and Sidney Poitier headlined that event. And Byard, he had a little session where he introduced Harry and Sidney to all the volunteers and sang a song for Harry and Sidney. He turned the tables on them. For me, I asked Byard if I could go down and work with SCLC. I thought they were working in Alabama. And he sent me to Ella Baker, who was the head of SCLC in Atlanta. And so I was introduced through Ella to a series of people. But I actually listened to what the older people were saying. So I listened to Ella, and she told me to go over and meet all these people. And so when I met Amzie, I listened to Amzie. Amzie Moore was the head of the NACP in Cleveland, and Amzie was the one who said what the students should do in Mississippi. He was sitting there looking at the a new information about registration that was coming out because of the 57 Civil Rights Act. And so Amzie said, well, the students should come in. He was the one that I met that saw what the energy of the student movement could do in Mississippi. And he said, we need to come there and do voting. So I had a year to go on my school contract and agreed to come back. And then Amzie passed me along to C.C. Bryant, who was the head of the NAACP in Macomb, and then C.C. passed me on to E.W. Steptoe, who was the head of the NAACP in Amite County. And so a part of what I see as what happened to me during those years is I was introduced to a network of people who had decided a way to live in this country in struggle, right? So they had figured out a way how to live a life that had real meaning, was rooted in their communities, but every day they were in struggle against, in this case, the state of Mississippi and the country in which it resides. And so that's what really happened for me. I didn't learn all about that in school. I learned about that through the people that I was passed along to, a small group of people who had survived the onslaught that was Mississippi.
To get out of writing a term paper. The only way I could think to do that was to tell the school, which was Antioch College, I'm going to risk my life in the South instead of writing this paper. Actually, I said that, I must say, to greater laughs for 40 years, but in my case, it was like this. I was born into a family that was pissed off. I mean, we were in Philadelphia, we were very poor. My parents knew why we were poor, had to do with the class nature of society and so forth. I was born working to change society. And I campaigned for Henry Wallace in 1948, as an example. When Chuck McDew, who was the, depending upon how you look at it, the first or second chair of SNCC, came to visit his girlfriend at Antioch, I just followed him back south. My idea was, and it was not uncommon, as a matter of fact, several of the women who spoke, I don't know if they said what I'm saying, but this is true of them as well. We looked at it politically. The gains that we were enjoying in the late 40s and 50s that came from the New Deal were being destroyed by the Southerners running Congress. And the reason the Southerners were running Senate and Congress was that the majority of their constituents couldn't vote. And they had taken over the country, and they were, in our views, destroying it. So I went south to help fix that. Except that I learned the work, the real work, was not in these general political terms. As a matter of fact, I never discussed what I just said with anybody during the SNCC time. I learned that to change society, to change the larger society, the job was to get Mrs. Jones a car so she could get to the mass meeting. That's the work. To me, that was transformative. That knowledge that it's one thing to say I want to change society, to have an intellectual approach to it, or this political analysis approach that is gave. It's another to say, I'm going to do the work. And I learned what the work was. And the work was boring. It was dangerous. It was like they say in the Army. It was, you know, weeks of boring work interrupted by excitement where you were getting your head beaten in and thrown in jail. You kind of look forward to that way to break the monotony. Yeah, that's not true. It was because of that experience that I entered what I'm doing today, which is organizing, working for unions. I think the quick answer to your question of what we did, of how we look back on the work we did, I think that the quick answer is we helped change the laws, the legal systems. We helped make it legal for blacks and whites to be together in the same place. Before it was illegal. The question is, what do we do with that now that we've changed these laws? And I think the answer, getting back to the intellectual level, has to do with figuring out the interface between class and race. I mean, that's short way of saying a whole big thing. And that's the question that I learned to struggle with in SNCC, didn't know it was a question, learned it was, struggled with it in SNCC, and still am.
Okay, so I get the second question, and it's related to something you said, Bob, about not learning it in school, because many of us who teach here in the Center for African American Studies teach the movement, right? We teach movement history and take as part of our charge sort of doing a corrective of the dominant narrative of the movement, which is sort of one great figure and lots of spontaneous moments, right? And lots of emotion and drama. And to engage in the work of teaching about organizing and the complicated strategy behind mobilizations and the interface between political figures and grassroots organizers and communities and actors, right, all these sorts of things. But at the same time, right, for many of us sitting on the stage with people like, we actually sort of feel our own version of hero worship, right, and have a sense of you all as great figures as well, right? And so I guess my question is about how, if you could talk some to, in particular to our students, about how you have thought about what created the conditions for you all to engage in actions which, you know, we read history and say that was an incredible amount of courage, right? That was heroic, right? What are the conditions that created that, and that ability to live with that sense of, with such a deep sense of meaning associated with this kind of work that it allowed you to have enormous courage?
Anybody can answer.
Okay. I mean, one of the things that Bob says all the time is that nothing that we did was really revolutionary or radical. It wasn't radical to vote. It wasn't radical to sit in a lunch counter. It wasn't radical to organize politically. What was radical was who we did it for. And that same issue, because in this country, there are a group of people, a lot of them in the African American community, and that's how we saw it at that time, who were viewed by the society to be used for economic and other exploitation. And the exploitation existed during the period of slavery. It moved to the period of sharecropping. It moved to the factories, and now moved to the question of intellectual property. And the question then becomes, who do you stand with? At the end of the day, that question was there in, as Bob talked about, and Ivanhoe and Charlie and Larry, that there were a whole group of people in Mississippi, in Alabama, in Georgia, and so forth, who this society had deemed to be in a particular place, and they were prepared to use both psychological intimidation and physical force to keep in a particular place. And we decided to side with them and to use the tools of voting, to use the tools of sit-ins, to use the tools of political organization, as the case of MFDP in Mississippi and the Lowndes County Freedom Organization in Alabama, to begin to move those people from where they were to where they should be in the society. And I think at the end of the day, the ability, as Larry said, to work with those people and to bring them along was in fact the most important thing that we did. It wasn't just facing Bull Connor or facing terror or facing, you know, the kind of things that get celebrated. It was the ability, the thing that distinguished SNCC and distinguished us from everybody else is that we felt that our responsibility was to work with the people who found themselves most economically exploited, most outside of the mainstream of society, and they were the people that we focused on in terms of working with. So I don't, as we look at it, I don't think anything in specific that we did was heroic or revolutionary. Our ability to stand with the people who as a group and a community, you know, were generally locked out both on the economic side, on the racial side, is what distinguished what we did.
If I can, well, first, to just kind of repeat what Cortland said, I mean, what was really revolutionary about SNCC was the people it chose to work with. And these are people that, for the most part, what might be called the civil rights establishment, did not work with, did not permit to have a voice. I mean, or the liberalists. I mean, the example that comes to mind is Hubert Humphrey on the floor of the 1964 Democratic Party National Convention after the rejection of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party's challenge, and after their proposal that two representatives of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, two that the Democratic Party chose, Ed King and Aaron Henry. And when Ed King told Hubert Humphrey that, well, maybe it shouldn't be him, it should be Mrs. Hamer, Humphrey's response was, the president, and I quote him, will not allow that illiterate woman to speak on the convention floor. Now, we haven't resolved that issue even today. It's one of the tasks ahead of you. But that being said, I want to say very briefly, you know, after the Civil War, after Reconstruction was a brief moment in which there actually was an attempt to establish a genuine democracy in the South. And it was brutally crushed. And for the next 100 years, force and violence was used to crush any manifestation of a black person's desire for freedom. Also white people, but I'll leave that discussion aside for a minute, for now. But what happened was that when we got to Mississippi, Bob Moses in 1960, the sit-in students erupting off the campuses of Toulouse and Jackson State, there was a whole set of people in that state, and indeed across the South, who through all of this had managed to survive, who through all of this had managed to generate ideas of struggle. And those, in fact, were the people who embraced us and taught us, A, how to survive, because we didn't know nothing. B, really fostered ideas of social change in our minds that we didn't think about. I think Bob said at one point, before he sat down with Amzie Moore, even though he had been taught about the Iron Curtain in school, nobody had ever taught him about the Cotton Curtain in the South. So these people who managed to survive were really almost planning ID. Amzie was watching the sit-in students and said, this is how I want to use them. And other people were taking us in it, and two things happened, and I'm going to end with this. One is they literally trained us in how to organize and how to struggle. And two, they gave us the tools. They pointed us in the direction of people who had the same potential that they were already manifesting. That's how we met Mrs. Hamer. She was one of Amzie Moore's people. And she emerges within the context of these young people who don't know very much, managing to get a small group of people to try and register to vote. And I think in all of this, without elaborating, there are real lessons embedded in this whole experience that are applicable today. And I've had some discussion with Wall Street Occupy people about that, but I'll leave it there.
Julian Bond has been saying recently, civil rights history was this. Rosa Parks sat down, Martin Luther King got up, and the white folks took care of everything. The idea of history being driven by heroes, or history being heroes, mitigates against social change. And, well, let me put it this way. Today, when people try to encourage other people to become active, you hear, well, you know, one person can make a difference. Well, aside from that being not true, when we were coming up, we didn't hear one person can make a difference. When we were coming up, what we heard is organize, is get together, then you can make a difference. And we got that from the union movement, also from World War II. I mean, our parents knew it took masses of people together to fight the war, to make history. It wasn't General Eisenhower, you know, he wasn't, it was masses of people. I think, consciously or unconsciously, in order to prevent mass movements like we were engaged in from happening again, some kind of way, the word has been put out not to get together. You know, one person can make, you know, go do your thing. That's the other thing, do your thing, as opposed to get other people together and do your thing together. That's the danger, I think, of putting heroes up. And it isn't that these people didn't make contributions. Martin Luther King gave great speeches.
Let me push back a little bit, because I appreciate the democratic sentiment. You didn't do anything heroic. What was really revolutionary was who mattered in the demos. Right? That's really important. But I think when we talk about the heroic relation to SNCC, it's not the hero that you're referring to. It's the moment in which you face raw terror. So Dorothy Zellner said something last week that really struck me. She said, whatever you thought about the South, it was actually worse. And so it's those, what I want to hear is that moment, right? From Harlem, you're in East Lansing, you're in where you're from, and you're in Mississippi, my home state, Alabama, right? Georgia, right? And there's this sense where you're confronted with that raw terror. You have to make the choice. What happened? When you saw what you'd never seen before, right? In that moment when you said, oh, you know, right? And I know you had to have that moment, right? What happened? And that's what I'm trying to figure out, because that's that moment that many of us would say, oh, no, I'm not sure.
Actually, I can't resist this, the way Ivanhoe and myself, and in a very peripheral way, Bob, shared the same moment. As it happened, we took Bob Moses to the airport in Jackson, Mississippi. This was in '63. You weren't here. And, for some reason, well, not for some reason, we know the reason, but we were followed from the airport.
After you dropped them off?
After we dropped Bob Moses off on the plane. And a couple other people in the car. Jesse Harris was in the car. And we get stopped at a Phillips gas station. And you won't know this, but Phillips gas station was notorious as being Ku Klux Klan hangouts. And the two white guys, Ivanhoe was driving, and as it happened, this gas station is in the same county where Matt Charles Parker was lynched in 1959, and the Pearl River flowed back behind the gas station. We were ordered out of the car, and we were held at gunpoint, and one of these guys clearly, absolutely, and everybody has these kind of moments in their experience, you're right, Eddie. He wanted to kill us. And his idea was he should kill us and then throw us in the river that ran. And he goes on and on and on about you. This Ivanhoe got sort of, after we recovered from this, sort of ticked off at me because he accuses us of being NAACP niggas. And I corrected it. Explaining to him that no, we were not. We were the Student Nonviolent Coordinator. Whereupon Ivanhoe was then dragged to the police car by this ticked off cop, and he's beaten in the police car and then thrown out. And this cop still wants to kill us. And then this other white guy who's in plain clothes says, well, not here, it's not a place. I don't know who that guy was. It was the only thing he said. And to this day, I think we're alive because that guy said what we said. But what that kind of moment forces you to consider is, do I really want to be here? I mean, after all, I could be at homecoming at Howard. I really want to be. And you choose. I mean, you know what the consequences are. And in those kind of moments, you decide either to stay or to go.
How do you recall that moment?
Well, it was not a happy moment, particularly since I got pistol whipped. But, you know, I think all of us have moments where we just say, I don't care what you're going to do, I'm not going to stop. I'm going forward. That's it. You know, all of us have those moments. The thing about SNCC was we had that moment inside of a SNCC family, which gave you strength to go ahead and step forward. Because you have your doubts. I mean, I spent 3 Christmases in jail. People didn't want to be around me at Christmas time because they knew I was going to get arrested. You know, but there you were. I mean, and I think that, I don't know the thing about heroes and stuff. You know, we were the people in some ways that we were trying to organize. This was our family. This was our community. I mean, these were our grandparents and aunts, whether they were from. And so there was this sense of respect that, you know, we were here to help move things along. You know, whatever was important. Sam Block once said that, you know, what got him his great opportunity in Greenwood, Mississippi, Sam Block was a SNCC organizer, was that he told people that if they marched tomorrow morning, he'd get sidewalks built in Greenwood. And Sam had heard someplace that they approved new sidewalks and stuff that was going to happen. So people walked and sidewalks came. And, you know, not the next day, but they announced they were going to do it. So it created motion for people, the sense that you could get together and organize, even around something as simple as a sidewalk. You know, people began to find strength, a sense of inner strength, you know, and that strength, you know, bonded people and united. SNCC for me, and I think for a lot of us, was a university. I learned a lot about life in SNCC. I learned a lot about myself in SNCC. I learned a lot about the world. I learned world history in SNCC. I learned American history in SNCC. It's things that I did not learn in school. I learned at the University of SNCC. And when Bob Moses talks about that what we need today is a constitutional amendment to guarantee a quality education for every child, it's like, yeah, why don't, what is the issue? Who does not want to have their children have a quality education? And if they do, why not? What is it that they're afraid they're going to learn? Because once you start talking about education, people are going to start talking about, well, what are we going to learn about? And the extensions go on, and they build till people get a brighter idea that there's a different kind of world they can live in and different things they can do with their lives, different ways they can govern themselves, different ways they can look at resources. Heroes is a kind of funny word. It's a media thing, and no matter where it is, but each of us finds in ourselves that moment. And when you find that moment in community, the difference between SNCC and other civil rights organizations in some ways also was, it's not always a major thing, but we truly believed in organizing. We did not necessarily motivate ourselves to mobilizing, even though Cox was one of the major organizers of the Civil Rights March of 1963, which is a mobilization, and it had its place. And I participated, Cox says we all have our little marches, in the Summer Montgomery March, which was a mobilizing force, and those things do attract, they create visibility. But what's important is when the march is over, what are we going to do? And sometimes that stuff takes away from the little folks who are trying to organize a farming co-op or a literacy school or something, because it doesn't seem romantic or dramatic or whatever. But we always went back to that because that's where the future was. That's where community strength was. And those aha moments it helps you get through those aha moments when, someone hits you over the head. You say, I can live through this. It's when you're in jail and they're feeding you slop and stuff or whatever. You get a postcard from Louis Doris Robinson, who's one of the executive secretaries, saying, I hope you're doing okay. And you say, yeah, I'm doing okay. It's pretty cool. And you share it with the other inmates, who don't know what the hell you're talking about. But it is a sense of unity. And I think in SNCC there was this strong sense of community, of family among ourselves, which we got from the communities that we were trying to organize in. They fed us and we fed them. And that collective motion, took us to where we are now. And the question is, you say, where do we go from here? It's not a snapshot that you stop and say, oh, God got hit over the head. Motion puts all that behind you.
I think that there are two or three things. First of all, Bob said he was 25 years old, and we considered both Bob and Jim Foreman old.
They were old. They were old at that time.
So therefore, you have to realize that, when you're the age that we were, death is not something that's imminent, and you think you can kick a hole in the sky. The second thing is that the community that the organization, we knew that there was going to be violence. And I'm sure Bob can tell you the many times he was beat about the head in Mississippi. But the question is, could you function and not be paralyzed by fear? And that was a prevalent discussion in the organization. And the third thing is that the people who you worked with and worked for lived with this every day and had no other alternative. Because if they voted, they got kicked, not only got beat about the head, they got kicked out of their house, they were shot. There was, I think in 1962 or 63, there was a piece in the in the New York Times, and they found maybe 40 or 50 bodies in the Mississippi River, and it attracted that much attention in the New York, because that's what people lived with. So my sense is, if we're going to organize as opposed to mobilize in these areas, being chased or being shot at or even being shot, was, very, to be expected. I remember, I know in Ohio when we were going into Miami, was it Ohio? In '64 was, what was the school we were at? Miami, Ohio. Miami of Ohio. I know many people going down there for the Mississippi Summer. They had, that was a time that Troyer, Cheney, and Goodman was, found missing. They weren't, their bodies hadn't turned up as yet, but it had a great deal of impact. We weren't even there as yet, but people knew what was going to happen or what was possible. But the question was, could you function in fear and terror and not be paralyzed? And I think once the decision was made to function in a situation where you could be, brutalized and still carry on, I think those who felt the need to brutalize you, at that point when we made the decision to continue and soldier on, their cause was lost, because the instrument that they tried to use to maintain their way of life was no longer the kind of fear that they had hoped they would have.
A bigger fear than the Ku Klux Klan violence in a lot of these communities was that you, meaning the SNCC field secretary, asked people to do something. They do it, register to vote or something like that, and then all this violence and reprisal would come down and you'd leave. You could go back to Washington, Charlie, or you could go back down to Jackson, Mississippi, or you could go back to school in Michigan, Ivanhoe. So a lot of the work was just demonstrating to people that no matter how much violence there was thrown at this effort, you couldn't be run out of town. You couldn't be run out of the county, even if nobody tried to register to vote. And many times, the first round of violence stopped anybody from trying to register to vote. But the point to establish in these communities was you couldn't be run out of town by anything, dynamite or shotguns.
So I think that's really an important point, which is, well, why should people work with us, right? What did we do to earn the right to have them go down and register to vote with us, right? So we had to earn the right, and I think all of what people are talking about was a part of earning that right to be an insurgent. So you had, the idea I have now is that we were operating in earned insurgency. We had to earn the right to work with the sharecroppers, the people who were being exposed to all this danger.
I stayed scared. I was just scared for 4 or 5 years. Sometimes I was more afraid of Ivanhoe than the Klan. So, because I worked for Ivanhoe, and he said, do this, and I had to decide, Klan, Ivanhoe.
Right, but you can't be scared all the time, right? So the question is, when are you in real danger? And so you learn from people you were working and living with, not the Ivanhoes, right? The Amses and C.C. Bryan, people who had lived there and knew the terrain, when you were in danger and when you weren't. And so if you couldn't figure out how to relax when you weren't in danger, then you were in deep trouble.
One of the things about local people that gave us a lot of space was, sometimes it would be, Charlie and I would be down in Esquina County when we were organizing down there, and we get a good night's sleep, in this violent place. But the reason we were able to get a good night's sleep was the local folks were sitting out on the porch with the shotguns and the rocket ship all night long, protecting us. When that happens, there's a bond there that, you can't break away from. They stayed up, they shared their food with us. It's not like SNCC people had any money. they shared everything they had, and in the final analysis, they were willing to sacrifice their lives for us. So getting brutalized every once in a while was really not as significant as what this community was going through, as a permanent existence. And, it made you want to stay.
And there weren't a lot of them, right, who were doing that. I mean, there was a few that had survived. And picking up on what Ivano just said, so it was the only time in my life where I could pick up any time, day or night, didn't matter how late, go someplace, knock on a door, drive so many miles, right? Knock on a door, someone was gonna open it up, give me a place to sleep, feed me, watch my back, right? And so this small network of people in Mississippi were the people who lived there that were the foundation that allowed us to do the work that we did.
Absolutely.
I want to, before we open it up, I want to ask this transition, because this is an interesting collection of folks here, right, in terms of SNCC, and then we'll open it up. This debate, there's a style of leadership that you've given voice to, right? And we know at least from our studies, that there's a debate within SNCC about how you organize, how you conceive of leadership, and this transition to Black power. How did that play itself out? There's a story about where you stood. There's a story about your involvement, how and what went forward from there. So can you say a little bit about SNCC and Black power before we open it up?
The argument inside SNCC wasn't over Black power. There was not a significant argument inside SNCC over Black power. The argument inside SNCC, if you're talking about 1966 on, say from the time Stokely first heard Black power, there was a very intense and ultimately unresolved argument about what the organization should be. Although that's generally cast in racial terms. Should there be white people in SNCC or shouldn't there be white people in SNCC? Really, the argument was, how should SNCC structure itself? It had been up until, for the first half of the 1960s, really in some ways a loose organization of organizers, which you could adopt projects and the people you organized might do things that you didn't agree with, but they were not ideologically or politically obligated to follow your organizational line. Classic example, the choice of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party after their rejection at Atlantic City to campaign for Lyndon Johnson and Hubert Humphrey. Most of the SNCC people disagreed with that choice, but the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party wasn't SNCC. It belonged to the constituency of the Mississippi. That are how groups like that and groups we organize fit into the organization was I think, from 1966 to the rest of the decades, an intense, unresolved, because it involves, well, how central should authority be? Should it be a membership organization with SNCC chapters? How much authority did the field secretaries have as distinct from the national headquarters in Atlantic City? A complex discussion which I think we didn't know enough to handle.
You know, there is also a policy discussion around Black power. I think after the 64 Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party challenge and moving on, the question, and I think the question that the Move On and other people face today, whether you can continue to protest and continue to ask those who oppress you to deal with the nature of your oppression. Because some of us felt they knew better about what the oppression was and why they were doing it than you, so asking them didn't mean much. So the sense of organizing yourself to to put yourself in a position of power, and to, like, for example, and it's a small thing in Lowndes County, but, you know, Lowndes County was 80% African American. There were 4 black voters. The question is, you know, whether we should protest police brutality and try to get the sheriff and the judges and so forth to do better, or should we, to the extent that we could, have regime change? That is to say, now begin to become yourself the sheriff, the tax assessor, the tax collector, the probate judge, take over the whole political system. And so that as we began to think about it, that as opposed to asking those who were in power to change their behavior, it was important in terms of, in that particular instance, you know, how we move to, in fact, seize power through you know, the vote political organization. And I think it was on that basis Stokely was part of leading that discussion in Lowndes County, and thinking that through, that, you know, Stokely started talking about how we need to see ourselves going beyond protests and going to the discussion of power. You know, I think, as Charlie points out, that discussion had a profound effect on the organization, because what we were saying is that the African American community needed to seek to exercise political power, and even though it couldn't exercise economic power, it needed to do that, and it needed to, and it had probably, you know, its most profound effect. I mean, it created a sense of breaking down a lot of the psychological intimidation, because it sparked, I mean, I think people talked about the sit-ins having profound effect, you know, I guess, but I think the thing that had just as profound effect in the black community, but has been suppressed in the discussion about African American history, is the effect of black power in the black community, and as an energizing force, and the sense that we need to take control of our own political, cultural, social, and, you know, at some point, economic discussion. So, I mean, I think black power had a profound effect, but it was the sense that you could not always keep protesting and asking those who oppress you to deal with the nature of oppression. You had to organize to get the things that you needed for yourself.
You know, one of the things about the 60s was that we didn't live in an isolated environment. There was a cultural world around us. Other young black people doing things in other areas of the country. Some of them spinning off from us, and some of them spinning off from their own roots and communities and stuff. And everything wasn't always political, but everything became political. So sisters started wearing afros. You know, that became a political statement of the times. But it was what it was, and, you know, I'm black and I'm proud. You know, black power, although it was never a fundamental argument inside a SNCC or something, we kind of assumed, you know, but when the media picks up on things, they take it into a whole nother direction, a whole nother drama, a whole nother dimension. And sitting in an office or out in the fields someplace, trying to talk to someone about registering to vote, and dealing with this heavy bombardment of what's black power, and other civil rights people are talking about reverse racism, and you get all of this stuff, you say, what's that all about? I mean, you know, black power, yeah, that's what we've been organizing for. It seemed okay last week. This week it's not, you know, and you kind of like run it, and you're suddenly an expert. People say, well, what do you think about black power? I say, well, don't know. You know, or you're in SNCC, aren't you? Well, yeah, I am. And so you're on the defensive about something that to you was no big deal. And suddenly to everybody else, it's a huge deal. And, you know, the whole world's talking about it. But I think that it was really no more to us, except for the fact that when you're organizers, you don't like to live in the eye of the media. And that's one of the things that Star Michael did, put us out there in the eyes of the media, to justify all of this. So when you're knocking on a door, talking about going to register to vote, the conversation became different. But I remember one of the nice things about SNCC was you were whoever people thought you were. So when I was organizing my first experience in Mississippi, I went to knock on some door, someone said, "Oh, the Freedom Riders, we're so glad you finally come here." SNCC, you were the Freedom, because that's what they knew about. And they were glad to have you there, and it was about time. And then you just kind of like roll right into the conversation. Our identity was whatever helped us do work. So, one day we became COPA organizers, one day we were voter education project organizers, SNCC organizers, CORE and SNCC people in 4th Congressional District, the 04, could just have interchangeable personalities. That's what organizers do. Organizers are about organizing, and their personality kind of becomes invisible as you kind of push the energy, or get energy from the people who help you do what you're doing. So I think that Black Power, although there's a lot written about it, and there's a whole cult around it, was what it was, and it still is, and I've still never understood what the big deal was, Black Power, I'm for it.
We want to open it up for questions. Right here. Hey.
Thank you all for being here today. This has been a wonderful experience. My question is, I wonder if you can talk about the recent assault on voter registration. I think there are like 17 states now who have enacted laws primarily directed toward minority communities to obstruct their voting in the next election. So I wonder if you all could comment on that. Thank you.
Yeah, I live in a state where that assault is well on the way. I live in Florida, where the assault really takes two. One is what I think is search for the right way, but a way to just kind of pick at little things that may or may not make a person eligible or ineligible to vote. And the greater effort is targeted at Black and Latino communities in Florida anyway. And you can see it. I mean, certain kinds of rules. The rules range from very precise rules around residency all the way through. And to me, it's almost reminiscent of the old Mississippi tactic of denying people voter registration, where we went to the circuit clerk's office in Mississippi to try and register to vote. The law said you had to interpret any section of the Mississippi State Constitution to the satisfaction of the circuit clerk. And there were about 280 some odd sections in the Constitution. Some of them ran on paragraphs. He wasn't going to give you a simple paragraph like, there shall be no imprisonment for debt. It was going to be, and sometimes the way residency rules, rules related, particularly in terms of moving and how they are implied or not implied. So there's a whole set of things like that. And the second level at which this campaign unfolds is specifically targeted at prisoners and former prisoners. So now Florida, for instance, wants to lengthen the amount of time it takes for a prisoner who has served his or her prison term from being eligible to register to vote. And without going deeply into the prison statistics of this country, I think you can get a sense of how that would impact on minority voters. That's Florida. I haven't been following it all across the country.
I think you got to be vigilant. These little things are happening all over the country in little ways. In some ways, they look like they're geared against the Latino community. In other ways, they're lazy against the black community. In some places, they're lazy against poor whites. You know, personally, I believe in universal registration, and I believe in same-day registration, so that, you know, if you're here, you vote. You know, and we can argue about other things, but if you're here, you vote. And there are states that have same-day registration, and they have very little fraud. You know, they have less fraud in states that have all of these rules and regulations and stuff, and you got to show an ID pass, sign and stuff. You know, it doesn't make any sense except to intimidate people out of their rights. And I think that we have to be constantly vigilant when we see this happening, whether we live in the neighborhood or not, because we live in the United States, and this stuff will bubble up. I mean, the Tea Party, this lady said on TV, what's her name running for president of the United States? Michelle Bachmann on Fox News. Last week, I'm watching this interview, and she's talking about, she's asked the question by a guy who supports same-sex marriage in Colorado. And she says, well, you know, in Colorado, the people didn't make that decision, the judges did. And she says, when I become president of the United States, I am going to have Supreme Court nominees that believe in strict construction in the United States the way it was originally interpreted. And I sat back and said, does she remember that that didn't include her? You know, you know, and you know, people just, it just goes right by, and we got to focus. I said, you should show you couldn't vote, you couldn't run for, you couldn't vote for president of the United States, you couldn't even vote, you know. And I think that we forget, you know, we hear all of this stuff, and we want to engage the, no, that's ridiculous, it's absurd. You know, but there she is, much like black people, you know, I guess we'll go back 316, you know, from her perspective, strict construction.
If it was on Fox.
But she said it.
My question is the title of this event, right? Where do we go from here? But in the context that today and also last week, as I'm listening to these stories, they're stories that are much different from my stories or the stories of my generation. And so I'm wondering how my generation is going to tackle racism, because racism is still here. It's just not as tangible or as visible, right, as it was at that time. And so without the violence, although there is much violence in our communities, but you know, how can we tackle these problems of racial inequality? We're at a point where my fear is that we're listening to these stories, but is this the last time that we're going to see racial organizing? Have we come to a point where people don't necessarily feel angry enough or energized enough to fight against racism? And we have politicians that won't talk about race. And we talk about, you were saying about, you know, we have to get into the system. So now we have these black political leaders, but they won't talk about race. So where does that leave us as far as the fight against racism?
You know, I think one of the things that we've all said is that what we did was not, you know, spectacular. It's who we worked with and who we did it for. One of the things that, you know, Bob is dealing with at this point is called the Algebra Project. One of the things that your generation faces is that, you know, there's a whole pipeline of young black people going to prison because they're surplus labor and they are not be able to function even less in the information age. I mean, how do we now get, you know, what is the critical path for getting that group of people who are now being systematically excluded from the society and the economy into the discussion? I mean, one of the things that, and what, you know, when we were coming along, we could, in the industrial situation, we could get away with, you know, one thing in terms of literacy, English literacy, so forth. Now, computers and math literacy is just as important as that. I So yes, the struggle is different. It is not, because of what was done during our time, you're not facing physical intimidation, and you don't have as much of the psychological intimidation, at least, across the board. But what we face, if you go, I live in DC, if you go, I would say 50 to 60% of those kids who are in the school system there cannot function in the economy in any real way. What is it we're going to do in terms of dealing with those young people and the critical, and most of them are black. I'm sure, Latino community is the same thing in terms of the poor white community. What is it we're going to do in terms of this situation? Because we had to deal with the political situation. We had to deal with the physical violence and so forth. But the key discussion always was economic. It was economic because we were brought here during slavery and the use of our labor, and it's still economic now. We had to deal with layers of stuff. I hate to say what we dealt with was stuff, but that's what we were dealing with, stuff. Now we have to deal with the economic issue, and it is a fundamental thing about how do we now integrate ourselves into the economy, able to function, and how do you people get the skills to be able to let them do that?
I think, although the specifics are different in many ways, there are lessons embedded in the movement we were involved in for now. You see, one of the things we learn how to do is talk to people in their own turf. We in Jacksonville, Florida, where I live, there is an Occupy Wall Street little group, and they occupy the downtown public park, Henry Plaza, which actually was a site that high school students launched sit-ins from in 1960. But so I went down there, and I engaged a couple in some conversation. And my question was, I understand being in a public park to protest, but really, Bank of America is 2 blocks away. SunTrust is another 2 blocks east of here, and Wells Fargo is next to SunTrust. So why not occupy Bank of America? Or why not occupy SunTrust? I see, because it's not clear, it wasn't clear to me, and this was not a hostile conversation. I said, it's not clear to me, if you're protesting the economic inequalities, the 1% that has managed to basically buy the US government, why don't you go where they are, which are the banks? And I said, I know there are consequences, and I said, then I identified myself as somebody involved with the sit-in movement in 1960. I said, I know there are consequences. I said, one of the things we had to do as part of the sit-in movement was talk among ourselves about whether or not we were prepared and willing to face the consequences. In our instance, they would be most immediately the prospects of violence. Secondly, jail. And at a whole nother level, the complete dismay of many of our relatives being hauled off to jail. So I said, that's one thing. And then the other conversation, the other thing I raised with him, and again, pulling on my own experience with the movement, because that I thought might be relevant to protest today, is I said, well, I live in a working class black community. Its occupants are made up of a lot of young people who don't have jobs, a handful of black people who are retired, and then a whole slice of black people who are working at low-level jobs. And I said, why don't you come out and talk to people in my neighborhood? I said, so, like, I live next door to a church. I said, you can come to the Zion Mission think about how you're going to speak to this church about what you were about. What's the language? I said, you know, we had to learn how to do all that. And I think, you know, if you're talking about effective struggle now, the same lesson applies. It's one thing for us as former SNCC field secretaries and academics to talk to each other. It's really another kind of thing to talk about talking in a neighborhood, trying to talk to people in the Baptist church, or trying to talk to people in the other institutions that structure. And here I'm talking about the black community, but I think it's as applicable in Appalachia as it is in West Jacksonville. And it seems to me that people who want social change today have not yet figured out how to do that. It seems to me that people who want social change today haven't really had a conversation among themselves about how they might do that. And that seems to me would be the first step in direct answer to your question.
I want to follow up what Charlie said. As we've all said, we were not the heroes. The real heroes of the civil rights movement were the people that risked their homes being burnt down, risked their lives, what we call local people, to register to vote. Why did they do that? They did it because they wanted a better life for themselves. It was to their self-interest to do it. They weren't organizing somebody else, they were organizing themselves. So the first question I think you have to ask yourself is this: are you a local person, or are you, like us, an outsider, you know, an organizer? I think the message of the 99% is most of us are local people today. And most of us need to organize our peers because most of us are up against it. And if we're not up against it, then I would say enjoy. You know, if you're one of the 1%, enjoy. The question then is, if you're a local person, how do you get your peers to understand, number one, they're up against it, number two, what they're up against, and number three, what to do about it? I don't think there's easy answers. I think the Occupy movement is addressing the questions that I just said. They're realizing that they are the 99%. My fear is that they're drifting off into, to use an old term, utopianism. In other words, they're starting to say, we're going to create the communities that we want to be. And they're looking inward instead of, as Charlie is saying, looking outward to organize. But that's the first question you have to ask yourself. Are you a local person or are you an organizer? I think the answer is you're a local person. And then from that point of view, how are you going to help yourself? What do you need from life? And who else needs the same thing from life?
Wow. Let's go here. Maybe it's because we have SNCC in the house that they have the air conditioner on in December.
Thank you all for a wonderful conversation. I'm interested in representation. Being a person from Mississippi, I'm interested in the ways in which the South is represented in terms of racial violence and racial terror. And it seems for many of you who were coming from the North to the South was this kind of quintessential space of racial terror. And it seems that one's entry into the South marked a sort of primal experience with racial terrorism and racial terror and sort of state-sanctioned violence. But thinking about sort of Baldwin's Harlem and thinking about Trumbull Park, all of these other representations of violence in urban landscapes, I'm wondering if you all or other people in SNCC that you all knew had experienced violence in these urban landscapes, and if so, what are the ways in which those experiences informed the ways in which you all, or the ways in which they navigated these southern geographies?
say no. I'll tell you why. I mean, certainly we were aware of police brutality. I grew up in Washington, D.C. and Springfield, Massachusetts. And in both instances, there were a solid core of policemen who were hostile to young black people anyway, in the 1950s when I was coming. So I was aware of it at that level. On the other hand, in going to Rouville, Mississippi, the first place I ever went in Mississippi, and on day one, walking down that dirt road with McLaurin and Landon McNairba, a car comes to a screeching stop, and out jumps a white guy with a pistol who says, "I know y'all ain't from here, and you're here to cause trouble. I'm here to tell you to get out of town." And this guy turned out to be the mayor. So even being aware of police brutality, I'm saying to myself, well, what universe have I now entered? When I find out this guy is the mayor, who was also the justice of the peace, owned the biggest business in town, was the hardware store, was president of the local White Citizens Council, occasionally policed put down, which is how he stopped us, and was the, broadcasting agricultural news on the local radio station. I'm saying, this is a different order of violence and confrontation. So when I say no, I have never experienced, even growing up in the North, anything like that. And then I discovered the experience was repeated during the whole 4 years I'm in Mississippi. So to me, it may be unfair, I don't know. To me, speaking just for me, it was just an entirely different order of violence and confrontation.
I grew up in Frank Rizzo's Philadelphia. And I got to tell you, the cops beat me up several times before I even went south of Chester, Pennsylvania. The difference was, when I got beat up for demonstrating in Philadelphia as a kid, there was a community in Philadelphia that felt themselves to be empowered, that protested the violence and so forth. The difference was, in the South, that community that would have protested were totally disenfranchised. I don't think the difference was the existence of the violence. The difference was the enfranchisement or disenfranchisement of the people that the violence was aimed at. Yes.
I live in New York now, but I grew up in the Midwest, and I teach race and the law as well as constitutional law for the City University of New York. And before I moved into academia, I was a civil rights attorney in Alabama and Georgia and North Carolina. Not that long ago, thank you very much.
God bless you, yeah.
My major concern was watching. It was long enough, though, for me to see, when you talk about they learn from us and we learn from them, the symbiotic relationship dwindle and become very strained to the point where there's a lack of basic trust between those black people who have gone off and gotten an education and those people in the community who need those people with the education. There's a lack of trust whether or not those coming back, and I've seen it going back into the community because I do talk in the churches and speak about these different issues, and I teach race and law, and I teach constitutional law, and I try to empower people around the Constitution and history. And it's been an ongoing experience in all of those different areas, in the Midwest, in the South, and in New York. And it's this sense that, what are you really here for? You took the crack in the door from affirmative action and you left us. And now what do you want? And even though we need each other, The black middle class does not have the clout or the votes to do the things they want to do. And the black masses need the education that the black middle class has to give. But at this point, we need some connection. We need some way to build organizing in which you use the skills of both of those groups. And when you ask the question, where do we go from here? How do we reconnect? Does it have to be something disastrous that takes place that brings us back together again? Or are we going to choose each other and not let segregation or some outside force pressure us into having to be together again? Can we choose to work with each other, understanding that we have an intertwined destiny despite whatever financial or economic resources we may hold?
Can I actually follow up on that? Because I think that's an interesting question. And part of what resonates to me so much about reading about SNCC, and in particular, Bob, one of the things that you said today is the deep sense of respect for the knowledge of local people. So there's not this assumption that it is just a one-way process, right? That in fact the learning, the two-way street of learning, and the sense that, and the interdependence actually operating. And I wonder if part of the question that you raise has something to do with the approach, and this connects to the question that you asked about being careful about how if people from the Occupy movement go to the church in your neighborhood, right, how are you going to talk to the people in the neighborhood, right? I mean, I think that's...
So I'd like to talk about that with respect to the work that the Alder Project and that I've been involved in. So it took 10 years, much longer than the Mississippi experience, which was, from 1961 to 1965, right? So I worked at Lanier High School for 10 years, from 1996 to 2006, trying to think through and experience what you were talking about with the kids at the bottom, right? So this is a high school that's at the bottom of Jackson, and we were trying to work with the kids in the high school who are at the bottom in the high school, including the overage 9th graders, right? The kids who in middle school are acting up, they send them to some kind of institution that they have, which is not really a school, and then when they get a certain age, they ship them off to high school, right? So they were asking me and looking at me with the same question that you were saying, right? What do you really want, right? And so so part of the answer was that, and it's the same answer in a different sense that we had to answer in the movement in the 60s. We had to earn that insurgency. So we had to earn the right to work with the sharecroppers and so forth. So we had to earn the right, in some sense, to get them to the point where they are saying, okay, I'm willing to do this math, right? So they had to understand that you were really there with them, right? And so that took years. It took much longer than the voting. I spent 10 years there in the school, right, working to figure out that problem, right? How to work with them, how to do it. So it's a real question. What is the black community and people who have, gained some purchase on the society? What are they going to do?
Yes. First, I just want to say it's just a blessing to have you all here. My question is this, though, that what comes to me when I listen to this conversation is this profound sense of humility and revolutionary patience and receptivity, willingness to listen to other folk. Courage is the common denominator. Now you call it heroic or not, but I just call it courage and visionary. And A lot of people not courageous and vigilant like y'all. That's just a fact. That might make you feel unsettled and so forth, but it's just true. And I think that needs to be said. But in addition, the very folk that you all were learning from were courageous. And you became even more courageous by your patience, your listening, your humility, your willingness actually to work alongside as opposed to being above. Now, there's a clash for me between what we call loosely democratic time and market time. And we live in an oligarchic economy with a market-driven culture where things are quick, 24/7 cycle news, celebrities appearing every 6 weeks, different ones at different times and so forth. Then you got democratic time, which is organizing, connecting, building bonds of trust, building bonds of order. Now, there's a major shift that's taken place, even from the 60s to now. If the first American Revolution was against monarchy and the second one was against slavery, and you all were dealing with the vestiges of white supremacist slavery in the form of vicious Jim Crow and Jane Crow in the form of American terrorism, then today it's oligarchy. That's what the Occupy movement is absolutely right. But the oligarchs rule in part because of the market time, and they know democratic time is slow. Very slow. And one of the reasons why you all, I think, were able to break the back of white supremacist apartheid is because you did get state intervention. It wasn't just the grassroots organizing movement. You convinced some elites to deploy power, whereas convincing those same elites to employ power to break the back of oligarchs is a whole different thing. To break the back of plutocrats is a whole different thing, let alone a globally capitalist economy. So when we look at the parallels, how do we capture the revolutionary patience, the humility, the willingness to learn from everyday people, the courage that you have in this market time, this hyper-capitalist culture where young folk are bombarded all the time? And I give you an example. In the academy these days, we got magnificent students here at Princeton, we all know that, but humility is not a premium. In higher education in America, courage is not a premium. It's conformity. It's getting over and getting big, becoming a star quick, sometimes by any means. So when we're talking about counterculture today, we're talking about a radical kind of counterculture, even maybe more so than what you all encountered in the 60s, even as we have so much to learn from. Does that make sense to you? Or is that too downbeat?
I mean, I think, for the people who are victims of this discussion, all the stuff that's happening, quick time and all that, doesn't change their situation. I mean, it is what it was. It is what it was 50 years ago. It is what it was, 100 years ago. I mean, the big discussion is the relationship between those who have and those who have not. And the question then becomes, while there is a lot of, lights and flashes and so forth, I mean, I think the thing that we're saying is, one of the things that we used to say in SNCC is that, strong people don't need strong leaders. And the question of building and working with the base and beginning to make sure that they're engaged and they're involved and they trust and so forth is the Revolutionary Act. The Revolutionary Act doesn't change. It changes to the extent that you get people involved. It doesn't get changed based on the people that you're fighting against. It's with the people that you're trying to involve. Now, people, we did have allies, as you mentioned, and we did have people who did work with us. But it does seem to me that only comes when you energize the people who you need to be talking to. So I think, as I see it today, which is, that the fundamental, what's the name of that song? The fundamental things stay the same as time goes by, or something. What's the name of that song? No. I mean, it does seem to me that what is fundamental is the relationship between those who are trying to create change and those who it's important to have that change made. And I don't think anything that has occurred, Twitter, Facebook, all that sort of stuff, doesn't change what needs to be done going forward.
I think that's an important point, and I wanted to come back to what you were saying. I think Charlie said it in a kind of passing stage, but we need to talk to each other. And you're saying in another way that the community feels that certain elements of its own have deserted and moved on, become superstars, whatever, but they're not back here. The part of the Occupy movement that caught my attention was when it was in Oakland, and they closed down the port for a day. Now, I don't know if you understand what that means. That's a radical action. Closing down the fourth largest port in the United States for a day. The impact on that on the economy is amazing. They closed that port down for a week. Things would really be radically different in the United States in terms of who's going to react to whom and what kind of force. You know, I think that when Charlie said you need to come to the neighborhood and talk, our core among African Americans is that we should never leave the community. We have to stay there. You know, it doesn't mean that you have to live in a shack or on the corner. You know, those things are disappearing one way or another, or urban renewal. That's an old term, urban renewal. You know, but it does say we have to come back, we have to have patience, and we have to listen to folks out there who we don't think are very smart, but they think they're very smart, and they're surviving. A lot of them are surviving better than us. You know, so it has to be mutual respect and a conversation about how we move forward together. I think there is a lot of turmoil within the black community about itself. And let's face it, black adults are scared of their children. You know, how come? They're their children. You know, we have to deal with that. You know, and the only way we can deal with it is to pull us together and start talking about it and they have to be a part of that conversation. I mean, this communications has to take place, or we become more and more isolated and more fearful of our own shadows. And, you know, we can't walk away from it. You know, one of the interesting things that Marion Barry recently did in D.C. was he introduced a piece of legislation. Now, D.C. has one of the greatest human rights laws in America. You know, you can't discriminate against anything in D.C., although they do it every day. But, you know, so he's now trying to amend the Human Rights Act to say that prisoners cannot be ex-offenders cannot be discriminated in applying for jobs. You know, how about that? You know, that affects hundreds of thousands of people in America. It affects thousands in D.C. because, you know, they got a record, they can't go get a job because, you know, it's all silently talked about, but you put that resume under your folder and say, I'll call you back. Well, I think things like that need to be supported up front by leadership, by community, by churches, by everybody, because each little step creates another layer of consciousness and another layer of unifying, you know, within our own communities about who we are and what we're about.
But do we have 10 years though?
Well, whether we do or not, we have to do it. I mean, Bob did it. He's still doing it, you know, and
What's the alternative?
yeah, what is the alternative? And the other is that we have to still respect the concept of nonviolence. Now, you know, I used to tell people that I was not nonviolent. You know, I would love to have been. You know, it takes a lot of strength to be nonviolent. I'm not Charles Sherrod or John Lewis. They believed in the blessed community. I was just trying to work for change, but I believed in their rules. You know, and to be in that movement, I had to follow their rules. And I learned that that's an important strength to have. So I talk about nonviolence from time to time, even though I am too corrupted, you know, to really believe today if someone came up and punched me in the mouth, I wouldn't punch him back. I'd like to think that I wouldn't, no matter how vicious they were. But I think we have to talk about that in our own community, you know, and we don't have to romanticize it. There's a practical reality about community that requires us to do that. So, I mean, I think that you raise an important point, and we have to address it, and we have to, I mean, when my father wanted me to go to CCNY, because he thought it was the best university in America. It was free. It was really free. You know, free schools now cost a lot of money. You know, but like a lot of youngsters, I wanted to get away from home, so I went to Michigan State. You know, and he said, well, "Okay, you go there, you pay for it." And I learned that lesson. But I never was far from my community. You know, and actually I went there and came back home by way of Mississippi. So I think we have to find a way to answer that. And I'm not, you know, not away from where you are, but we are still in charge of making change, and we can make change. I mean, I don't care how fast the society gets, how technological it gets. Yeah, there are new celebrities every day. You know, the way to make the newspapers is to do something stupid. And then you're on all the talk shows, and you're on all the movies, you're on all the Hollywood magazines, and you know, Lindsay Lohan, you know, she goes to jail. And I'm trying to figure out who cares. You know, why does TV cover her? You know, it's ridiculous. There's serious things going out there. You know, just leave her alone. You know, but we have to be serious about ourselves, and we have to teach these values to our children, and we have to teach, and our children have to be able to communicate back with us.
It's probably worth noting that, you know, wasn't huge numbers of people that began this process. It was Bob and I were counting up recently, the number of people who committed full-time in Mississippi in 61, 62, 60 years leading up to the Summer Project. I come up with 23 people, young people, who postponed their education or dropped out of school completely to commit 24/7 to the movement. I went to Howard University. Courtney was there, Stokely, and you count the NAG, Nonviolent Action Group people. I mean, they were definitely a minority of the campus pop. In other words, the population today isn't all that different than it was 50 years ago in terms of their willingness to commit to action. What you have to figure out how to do, which is what we had to figure out how to do, was how to challenge them and maybe pull some of them into action. I wound up in Mississippi because Lawrence Giat, then a Toulouse College student, stopped me. I was on the way to Texas for a civil rights workshop as a student who'd been involved in the cities. And this Toulouse student says, well, why are you going to Texas for a civil rights workshop when you're standing right here in Mississippi? It was a challenge. And I had to think about that. And before I knew it, I was up in the Mississippi Delta. So if you look at the 1960s, the movement we're here partly to talk about, at least a significant part of it is the kinds of challenges black people made to one another within the context of the black community. That seems to me to be relevant today, even if the issues aren't going to be the same that we had to confront in Mississippi or Alabama or Georgia. This notion we have to figure out what challenges we make and when and how. That starts, again, I think, with the conversation that also characterizes movement among people interested in change.
Yes, I just want to respond to Professor West. You've left something out. There's between the rapid pace of the culture and the patience it takes to organize, you've left out one thing, faith. What sustains the organizing is faith. Maybe it's religious, maybe it's ideological, but it's the sure knowledge, if you keep going, eventually things will get better.
Well, is that faith or is that optimism that could be the I mean, faith is not that things are going to get better. Faith is that you're going to have your integrity intact no matter what things are.
Yeah, I think, let me just say,
One second progress, the other religious exception hope.
no, I am by religious, by no means. I want you to understand that, you know. But, one of the things that Eddie just said off the hand, are you prepared to wait 10 years? And I think that, in terms of that is the fundamental question. Are you prepared to see what that problem is and work on it and make it your life's work? Even if you're doing something else, always make it your life's work. Because unless you understand that that is fundamental to your existence and the existence of all of us within the community, then it doesn't work. And change, Charlie pointed out, changes, and everybody knows, revolutions are not mass movements. They're caused by small groups of people who have a dedicated understanding of where they want to go and be able to talk and convince people to move in that direction. And I think that is, to me, what you have to first fundamentally ask yourself. Ed, again, the question that Eddie asked about violence. Do you believe, when you were tested with violence, did you believe that what you were doing was important enough in terms of your life's work to keep doing it in the situation of intimidation? The same question that you have to ask in a situation where there is not violence. In the question of flash and dash or whatever comes along, are you prepared to dedicate yourself on a steady path to get where you need to be? Because at the end of the day, if you don't, we have confusion and cacophony and whatever. It's important to stay the path and create the critical path to get where you need to be.
So, on a note of hope, so one way to think about the country is that we sort of move along and expand the reach of who the constitutional people are, who we the people are, in 75-year cycles, right? And so you can think about 1787 down to the meltdown, right? And we got rid of constitutional property. The constitutional property didn't quite become constitutional people, but we had another 75 years, right? And we come to the civil rights movement that we're talking about here, and we expand the people who had been constitutional property and didn't quite become constitutional people became more of constitutional people, right? And we're about 2/3 of the way in our next 75 years, right? And so the question is, are we going to keep expanding the reach of who the constitutional people are in this country? Are we going to keep working at? The country doesn't have to have a cycle, based on presidential elections. There's something else going on in this country which is much deeper, and which is happening over every 3/4 of a century, right? And so the question is, what are we thinking about how that next unfolding is, right? Because we're not anything in this country if we're not a constitutional people. And so, and the reach of, there's one thing which is, well, what's the substance of being a constitutional people? But there's another of, what's the reach? Who are the constitutional people? So we started out with white male property owners, and then we went on and expanded it, got rid of constitutional property, and tried to figure out, well, who are some other people that might be constitutional people? Women, They could be constitutional people in some sense, right? And so we're keeping, there's a struggle that's going on that's very deep in the country, and I wouldn't give it up. I mean, people want to say, oh, it's just economics, and that's the only reason why people want to have kids in school or something. No, there's something else going on in this country that has to do with very deep questions about, and one way to get a hold of them is to think about that issue. Well, who were the constitutional people when we started, and how have we expanded that class of people, and how are we going to keep doing that?
And on that note, can we thank the panelists? Thank you, and we know this is the end of the term. Tomorrow's the last day of classes, but I wanted to remind you, some people were clapping their hands. We wanted you to save the date. We have the Toni Morrison lectures on April 17th, April 19th, and April 24th, and they will be delivered by Bill T. Jones. So we hope that you join us then. Have a great, great winter break. Take care. Thank you again.